The courtroom held its breath. A man who had once been declared innocent stood accused of a far darker crime, and the small county that had freed him now looked to lock him away forever. Please help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The headlines screamed, the cameras multiplied, families sat in stunned silence, and a nation found itself arguing not only about one man's guilt or innocence, but about how a justice system could both fail and claim to have righted itself. This is the story of a life twisted by decades of conviction, exoneration, legal fights, suspicion, and a murder that would tear a county in two. Tonight, we step into that world, the grease and dust of a salvage yard, the hush of a courtroom before the verdict, the weary faces of families who wanted answers. This is a chronicle of evidence, of lies alleged and believed, and of an unrelenting fight for justice that refused to stay in the shadows. In the broad fields and small towns of northeastern Wisconsin, stories run deep and reputations run deeper. One of those reputations belonged to a man who had already lived through 2 lifetimes by the time the nation first learned his name again. He had once been convicted of a violent sexual assault, imprisoned and vilified, and then, against the odds, exonerated by the advance of DNA testing. That exoneration was not theoretical. In 2003, DNA testing cleared him and pointed investigators to another man, and he was released after serving nearly 2 decades behind bars. His name, familiar now to millions, had been splashed across newspapers once more just a few years later when a local photographer went missing after a visit to an auto salvage lot where he and his family did business. The woman, whose life had been ordinary and busy, vanished on a routine assignment that Halloween weekend in 2005. By November, suspicion had converged on the man who had fought to prove he was innocent only to wake up to accusations of something far worse. The arrest came in the glare of cameras and the hum of talk radio. Within a year, he would be convicted of murder. To understand how this small community became a national obsession, we have to go back further, to the feeling of being trapped in a place where everyone knows everyone else's business, to a local law enforcement culture that had a history, a complicated history of mistakes, accusations, and tight-knit relationships that made some observers worry whether officers could truly investigate without bias, and to a legal system that, on paper, promised objectivity but in practice sometimes moved with human flaws. These are the currents in which the events of this case swirled. The victim was a 25-year-old freelance photographer who had come to photograph vehicles for an online marketplace. She was described by friends and family as bright, professional, and quietly determined, the sort of person who took pride in her work and in the way she documented the world. That ordinary professionalism made the abrupt, devastating gap she left behind all the more unbearable. Her family, suddenly flooded with media attention, wanted only answers. What happened to their daughter? Who could have taken her from them? The community split between those who wanted swift justice and those who worried about a hasty conclusion. The balance between grief, anger, and the search for truth would prove fragile. It was October 31st, a day that for many meant costumes and trick-or-treaters. For one young woman it was a workday, a chance to photograph a vehicle for a buyer. She drove alone, as she often did, stopped at the salvage lot, took photographs, logged them, and left. Later, she didn't return a call. Later still, when friends realized something was wrong, the alarm was raised. The initial hours after someone vanishes are a blur of hope and dread. In this case, as the news spread, people combed the area, neighbors walking fences, family members calling numbers, local shops checking receipts and security footage. The salvage yard, an ordinary place of rusted metal and manual labor, became a site of national scrutiny. The police searched for routine clues, footprints, tire tracks, scratch marks, signs of a struggle. But what would transform this from a local missing person case to a murder investigation were a few hard, immovable facts that detectives believed they could place at the center of the story. According to prosecutors, the woman did not leave of her own choice. A vehicle that had been seen earlier that day was found abandoned. Shortly after, pieces of evidence, a car key, traces of blood, and other material were collected near or on the salvaged property. There was, prosecutors argued, a chain of physical traces tying events to the yard and those who lived and worked there. Among these pieces were bodily samples and items of the woman's personal effects. These items would later be presented as key links in the courtroom. Pieces of a puzzle prosecutors said could only fit one way, but evidence can be read in different ways. One person's convincing proof can be another person's ambiguous clue. When physical traces are limited, interpretation grows in importance. Was a hair found on a car proof of a violent act? Was a key misplaced or maliciously planted? Questions like these took on enormous weight, because human lives, the accused, and the victim's family hung on the answers. When investigators first descended on the salvage yard, they were acutely aware of two things: the need to preserve a crime scene and the reality that in a small county, many of the investigators had known the accused for years.
In the days that followed, police performed interviews, executed searches, and collected items they believed relevant. One early point of contention was jurisdiction.
The accused had previously litigated against local authorities after his exoneration. He had sued the county, its sheriff, and the district attorney, seeking damages for the years he spent in prison. That lawsuit, still unresolved when the photographer vanished, created a combustible backdrop. Some locals and observers alleged that certain officers might have a motive to act harshly because of bitterness or resentment toward the man who had sued them. Others insisted that investigators were doing their duty with professional rigor. The question of whether the same county's law enforcement could remain impartial became a central tension in public debate and in media coverage. Detectives obtained the missing photographer's vehicle and sought DNA and trace evidence. They tested items at state crime labs, compared samples, and built a timeline. During this period, the accused nephew, a teenager who had lived with him and worked at times at the salvage yard, was questioned by police. Following intensive interrogation, the nephew provided a statement that prosecutors later used to charge him as an accessory. That statement, however, drew controversy. The nephew would later recant, saying he had been coerced, frightened, and that his confession was not reliable. That claim of coercion would ripple through appeals and court filings for years to come, drawing attention to interrogation methods and the vulnerability of young suspects. At the heart of the state's case were a handful of physical pieces they argued pointed squarely at the accused. These included the discovery of the victim's vehicle on the salvage property, alleged traces of the victim on the accused's clothing and property, and a key that prosecutors said had been used by the accused and found in a place they argued was consistent with the state's theory of events. Certain lab results, jury testimony from forensic scientists, and witness accounts were marshaled to construct a narrative of what prosecutors said had happened. Defense attorneys countered fiercely. They questioned the chain of custody for crucial items, raised the possibility of contamination, and argued that key pieces of evidence had been mishandled or misinterpreted. They also highlighted the county's prior mistakes, including the wrongful conviction that had led to the accused's earlier exoneration, as a reason to doubt local investigators' objectivity. In short, while the prosecution presented a linear tale of crime and culpability, the defense painted a more complicated picture, one in which errors, bias, and human frailty might have produced an appearance of guilt where none existed. A particularly explosive line of argument raised the specter of deliberate framing. Critics of the investigation, including journalists, legal scholars, and documentary filmmakers suggested that certain officials may have had motives to retaliate against a man who had sued them. Those claims relied on circumstantial inferences and the emotional force of the history between the accused and local officials. Law enforcement officials rebutted these allegations, insisting that they had followed the evidence wherever it led. Forensic testimony became a battleground. DNA, hairs, and soil samples were debated in expert testimony. The prosecution's experts testified to links. The defense's experts raised alternate explanations, in small details like the interpretation of where a hair could have come from, or whether a partial DNA match indicated presence at the scene. Juries can become the final arbiters. They are asked to weigh scientific testimony delivered by people who often sound confident and certain. The problem, in this case, and in many others, was that science rarely speaks in absolutes. It offers probabilities and interpretations, and it is in those probabilities that reasonable doubt often emerges. The trial drew a media frenzy unlike anything the county had seen. Reporters lined up outside courthouses, podcasts, television networks, and newspapers pored over every transcript, every motion filing. At the same time, the family of the victim watched proceedings with a grief the cameras could not capture. They needed more than speculation. They needed legally documented answers. The prosecution laid out its narrative. The victim had been murdered on or near the salvaged property. The accused's DNA and other forensic evidence tied him to crucial items. And the nephew's statement, despite later recantation, described a role in the crime. The defense, for its part, hammered on the flaws, the prior wrongful conviction, and its fallout alleged mishandling of evidence, and the radical possibility of a frame-up. The jury listened, the witnesses swore oaths, and the law took its slow, relentless course. After days of testimony, hours of argument, and the silent weighing of the jury, a verdict arrived. Guilty on the most serious charges. The courtroom shuttered with a sound like a closing door. For some, the verdict was a relief, a measure of closure after a harrowing investigation. For others, it was a catastrophe, proof that the system could convict again even after admitting it once had been wrong. One of the consequences of this case beyond the sentences and appeals was its effect on public imagination, the story's twists, the prior exoneration, and the questions about local law enforcement's motives made it ideal material for deep dive storytelling. A documentary series that followed the case and the trial captured the public's attention worldwide. The series presented the events in a way that many viewers found gripping and troubling. Others complained it was selective and one-sided. Either way, the documentary propelled the case to cultural prominence and turned courthouse details into a conversation about justice itself. The immediate legal outcome was a conviction and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The nephew was also convicted in a separate trial and given a long sentence. These legal outcomes stood, at least for a time, as the official resolution. The accused and his nephew had been found criminally responsible and punished by the state. But the aftermath was far from settled. Appeals, petitions, and motions continued for years. Supporters of the accused pursued further reviews of the evidence and argued for post-conviction relief. The nephew's lawyers argued that his confession had been coerced and that he did not truly understand what he was doing when he confessed. In 2016, a federal judge overturned the nephew's conviction on grounds that the confession had been coerced, a decision that electrified supporters and infuriated prosecutors, but higher courts later reinstated the conviction following appeals, leaving the legal status contested. Meanwhile, the documentary's creators were drawn into litigation of their own. Law enforcement officials alleged misrepresentation and sued the filmmakers and distributors for defamation. Courts ultimately dismissed some of these suits, finding that the documentary did not meet the extraordinarily high standard required to prove malice by the filmmakers. The documentary's defenders argued that it simply raised questions and presented viewpoints critics said it left out critical context. Public debate raged. What did the documentary show? And what did it omit? How much trust should the public grant a selective narrative? Did the series reveal institutional problems, or was it a partisan retelling? Did the series reveal institutional problems, or was it a partisan retelling? More broadly, the case raised painful questions about the criminal justice system. How can a system that acknowledges a wrongful conviction be trusted to prosecute a separate, serious crime fairly? To what extent does institutional memory, the grudges, friendships, and loyalties that fuel small-town life influence investigations? Are forensic labs and evidence chains infallible, or are they subject to human error? And to citizens, how do we balance our desire for swift justice with the need for methodical, unbiased investigation? In the court of public opinion, the case remained unresolved. For some, the guilty verdict was final and just. For others, the combination of prior wrongful conviction and troubling investigative choices meant an innocent man had been returned to the system he had once escaped, only to be ground down again. The truth, as so often in human affairs, sat under layers of interpretation. Years on, the accused remained in prison. His supporters continued to petition, to hold vigils, and to organize. The victim's family continued to grieve, a process uninterrupted by courts or cameras. The county continued to resist sweeping judgments, insisting the legal process had been followed and that justice had been done. What makes some cases burn into the national imagination? Often it is not only the events themselves, but the larger questions they ask about justice, power, and error. In this instance, the bitter irony that a man once declared wrongfully convicted could later be convicted of a heinous crime struck a profound chord. It is a narrative that resists simple moral closure. When we step back from the headlines and the trial transcripts, what remains is not an argument for simple innocence or guilt, but a reminder: justice is not a single verdict. It is a process, fragile, human, and imperfect. It requires not only evidence and law, but humility, transparency, and constant scrutiny. Cases like this one, with their tangled histories and explosive public fallout, are painful tests of a society's commitment to fairness. We can hold multiple truths in our hands: that a man was wrongfully convicted once, that the blood and soil and keys presented in a courtroom are not the same as absolute truth, and that a grieving family deserves answers. We can demand rigorous investigations, independent oversight, and a legal system that protects the vulnerable while pursuing accountability without prejudice.